let me start by thanking the Amrita Vidyapeetham, Vishwa Vidyapeetham for, I'm audible?
Yes,
Yeah.
ma'am. Yeah.
For making us a part of the International Symposium on Media Education and Research, Dr. Dinesh Babu Lakshmi for coordinating this interaction. Our thanks to Dr. U. Krishna Kumar, Director and Dean of Amrita Vishwa Vidyapeetham Kochi campus. It's a pleasure to be here to discuss our book. Um, when we started our community radio journey in the year 2000, it's been quite some time, 22 years, it was still a phantom we were chasing across South Asia. While in India, the civil society movement for reclaiming the airwaves had just begun at a small village in Telangana. It was Andhra Pradesh at that time. There were a few stations up and running in Nepal, including the much wanted Radio Sagarmatha in the Kathmandu Valley. So, 22 years later, today, we have over 600 community radio stations in India and Nepal put together. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about these stations, and another 25 or so in Bangladesh and Bhutan. Our book that we are going to discuss today is collection of chapters by academics, activists, and advocates from South Asia, and they address a range of issues that have arisen over these last 2 decades in the community radio domain. We are indeed grateful to all our contributors for sharing their valuable perspectives on community radio and helping us piece together the multi layered and complex reality of community broadcasting in South Asia. Our thanks to all the numerous community radio stations we visited in the region who, by opening their doors to us and sharing their experiences, kept us grounded to everyday realities of community radio. Yeah. So, you want to add to what I've said before we go on?
Not just to add my thanks to uh, Amrita Vishwavidyalaya for inviting us to engage in this book discussion, and I hope there will be some time for discussion towards the end. So yeah, please continue, Kanchan. Yeah.
All right. Uh, Okay, so we'll start with a background to this to community radio sector. So over the years, community radio has gained credence worldwide as it's usually looked upon as an alternative to the mainstream broadcast media. It is looked upon as an entity which is owned and managed by marginalized groups. We talk about community radio as a tool for sustaining development and giving voice, as Professor Pavarala had said, talking about voice of, voice of the voiceless. So giving voice to the unheard and contributing towards strengthening the communication rights of people. So there is a lot of buzz around community radio in the whole of South Asia for the past, a decade or so. And now, given that it has played a very active role during the pandemic also. Now, even before the pandemic, if you look at India, it had leveraged the potential of community radio for facilitating electoral literacy, what they call the voter education, during the 2019 general elections. Community radios have been also, they have been an integral part of projects that seek to augment democracy, women empowerment, and social change. If you look at Bangladesh, they have been utilizing the potential of community radio stations for mainstreaming participation of youth and marginalized populations in national development and also for disaster management. Nepal is actively seeking a distinct policy that recognizes its 300 strong community radio sector. In Nepal, there is no policy, but there are still 300 strong, there are 300 community radio stations. Sri Lanka is lobbying with government to set up autonomous community radio station, and Bhutan, Maldives, as well as Pakistan are experimenting with the concept to explore its long-term prospects in their respective contexts. However, the beginning of this ferment for community radio sector in various South Asian countries could be traced back to a little over 2 decades ago when the Bangalore Declaration was signed in India in 1996, followed by what we call the Pastapur Declaration. This happened in Telangana, very close to Hyderabad, in the year 2000, both advocating for a third independent tier of broadcasting outside of the state and the market that would signify democratic media spaces. Um, Representatives from Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka were also present when these two declarations were formalized, that anticipated the eventual freeing of airwaves from government monopoly in the region. Around this time in India too, initiatives by grassroots NGOs such as Kutch Mahila Vikas Sangathan in Gujarat, Alternative for India Development in Jharkhand, Deccan Development Society in Andhra Pradesh, and we call it Myrada in partnership with another NGO, Voices in Karnataka. They served as conduits for propelling the formulation of the community radio policy in India. So these were the experiments which helped in bringing about community radio policy. They helped the advocates to lobby for community radio policy. So community radio policy was seen as sketching the beginnings of media democracy and giving voice to the people in South Asia. So details about these landmarks of community radio movement in India as well as other South Asian countries are available in some of the chapters of this book, and of course our earlier book also, which is The Other Voices: The Struggle for Community Radio in India. So this book is an effort to understand the state of community radio in South Asia through a perusal of its historiography, of the policy process, characteristics, and underlying principles, in addition to its linkages with conceptual issues of media democracy, as well as the some of the pragmatic concerns of daily practice of community radio. So community radio is a medium which is supported also by multilateral agencies, and one that requires constant negotiation with the state and civil society for its existence. So all the articles that have been included in the books, details of which we will share as we go further, they seek to make theoretical interlinkages also that contribute towards a more nuanced understanding of community radio in South Asia within the context of media globalization and ramifications for access and control of the communication spaces. I think I moved the slide a bit early. So we are moving now to community radio in South Asia, and how there has been the scenario there as far as community radio is in South Asia is concerned. Right? So let's look at the socio-political, economic, and cultural diversity, how that is reflected and mirrored in community radio scenarios, all that are found in in the region also. Right. So the South, over with over 300 community radio stations to flaunt, including the first ever established in the region, Nepal exhibits assorted ownership models, including by NGOs, cooperatives, local governments, authorities, or even commercial organizations. But as I said earlier, the country still awaits a clear-cut policy on community radio. India policy guidelines for community radios were issued in 2003, and they allowed only educational institutions to set up the station. This was modified in 2006 to include other civil society organizations, with about 300 stations that are there today. So you see, although we talk about South Asia as a region, but different countries have the community radio scenario in different countries is different depending upon their socio and political realities. Community radio in India, we have a good policy. We are the ones who were pioneers in bringing a policy, but we have very few community radio stations. Nepal does not have a policy, but there are about 300 stations. Bangladesh also witnessed a decade-long advocacy effort by development organizations. They came up with a policy in 2008. There was a new policy, a kind of a policy reform that happened in 2018, and they right now have about 18 community radio stations there. There are active deliberations that have been held in other South Asian countries like Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Maldives, and Pakistan is also weighing its options. So as was said in the introductions, Professor Pavarala, who's the UNESCO Chair on Community Media, and we are a few faculty members who work with him as faculty fellows. We recently facilitated the policy deliberations with Bangladesh and Nepal in collaboration with their regional UNESCO offices. The effort was to convince policymakers of the exciting prospects and multiplicity that community radio can bring to the respective national development goals and for expanding the media outlets in all the countries. So the entire South Asian region at present is going through a period of unprecedented economic, social, and political shifts and challenges, as you all know. So, in such a cultural and social context, listening to people's voices for decisions that affect their lives becomes very significant. And so, community radios, which can play this role of bringing people's voices, to the front and, to the public domain, because community radios are owned, produced, and operated by people themselves, is very, very important. So that's something that needs to be promoted. So that's what this book does for now, right? However, the formation of a dynamic and autonomous community radio sector in South Asia seems to be perpetually under progress, in the sense of being slow, gradual revolution that has not yet managed to fully realize its potential to open up and democratize media landscape in the South Asian region. There is an urgent need to facilitate policy environment in South Asian region that enables access to media by people and therefore recognizes their voices. Um, it is only through medium like community radio, alternative media like community radio, that the issue of voice poverty can be addressed. So what is voice poverty? It is the denial of voice as a consequence of systemic restriction on modes of self-expression that provide people opportunities to participate in decision making. It is not listening to people's voices. So it is through a medium like community radio that those voices can be heard, and it is important to promote such a medium, right? And for that, there needs to be a policy reform as far as community radio is concerned, right? So this book also advocates for such policy reform. Although community radio has become a reality in some of the countries of South Asia, it is not difficult to identify the challenges that make the sustainability of this third tier of broadcasting in the region a daunting task. So some of these hurdles, such as bureaucratic delays in issuing of licenses, prohibitive costs of technology, vanishing spectrum for communities, declining volunteer support, have been addressed in various chapters. So what I'll do is hand over to Professor Pavarala to talk about some of these issues that are crucial for a democratic and sustainable community radio sector in South Asia. Professor Pavarala.
Thank you, Kanchan. I hope all of you are still with us. Let me just, if it hasn't become clear from Kanchan's comments, community radio the development of community radio is one of the most exciting media development trends to have occurred in South Asia over the last decade or so. So this is something very important for media also against the, yes?
Yeah, we lost you in between. Yeah, please continue.
Yeah. So let's see what is the larger context, larger institutional context against which we can talk about community radio in India and its neighborhood in the larger South Asia region. Because you can't understand media development without getting a idea of the larger socio-political environment. So this slide, I'm talking a bit about the issue of democracy in the region, right? I mean, you will all agree that to have a sustained, autonomous community radio sector, you need democracy, right? I mean, you need a proper democratic ecosystem for us to sustain community radio. Now, if you look at political science literature, they talk about different models of democracy, some of which are obvious to us, like electoral democracy, democracy by majoritarian participation, and so on. But equally important for democracy is a participatory model of democracy, a deliberative model of democracy, a more egalitarian model of democracy. If you look at the countries that Professor Kanchan has mentioned in our region, democracy has had some ups and downs. But in spite of that, we can all say fairly confidently that there is some amount of substantive procedural democracy. So every once in 5 years or whatever, there is election and there is a new government that comes into play. You know, sometimes there are aberrations where elections don't quite happen, but there is a procedure for democracy. However, for community radio to establish itself and grow in a healthy manner, we need more than procedural democracy. We need participatory democracy. We need a democracy where citizens deliberate among themselves about the state of the nation. We need a more egalitarian democracy where everyone can participate equally, right? So we need citizen engagement, citizen participation for real democracy to be there. Only then can community radio sustain itself and work as a vibrant medium. Now, if you look at different countries in the region, Nepal has had a very volatile political situation. For years, they could not formally adopt even a new constitution. And even today, community radio does not have a legal recognition in Nepal's constitution or in Nepal's legal environment. In Sri Lanka, as Professor Kanchan has mentioned a little while ago, it still does not have legal recognition. Sri Lanka has had decades of civil war, and as a result, civil society has been on a decline. It's a very weak kind of a sector in Sri Lanka. And for community radio, you need a vibrant civil society, which is facing some kind of a challenge in Sri Lanka. Even as we speak today against the rising inflation and the protests of citizens in Sri Lanka, there still is no community radio. There is talk about creating a vibrant democratic setup for community radio in Nepal, but it's not yet happening. Bangladesh also had its checkered career for democracy. In Bhutan, which used to be a monarchy until recently, is now a democratic republic, but it's not a democracy in that sense in which we understand in India or in most other democratic societies. There is some community radio that has started in Bhutan, but it still requires a more participatory, deliberative, egalitarian kind of a democratic environment for community radio to thrive. Now, a second macro issue that one needs to understand is a development perspective. If you look at media in the South Asia region, it was always linked with the idea of development. If you look at radio from the beginning in India, it was meant as a tool for communicating development, as a tool for citizen education, as a tool for nation building, and so on. So community radio, in many ways, has become a way in which governments try to understand community radio as nothing but an extension of that developmental perspective. So the policy of community radio in India, for example, allows only registered NGOs to apply for community radio license, right? Because there is a certain pre-existing ideology of using radio for development. NGOs were thought of as a primary agent other than the government to promote development, and therefore, they thought they could have a right to broadcast. But if you look at certain developments in the community radio sector, because radio stations are struggling for financial sustenance, they look towards the government for support. And this has cast some shadow on the relative autonomy and independence of community radio. You will see the same thing in countries like Bangladesh, which has a very large in certain areas is much larger than the government of Bangladesh itself, right? But it is dependent on large donor agencies, on large international agencies for funding. So that also casts some doubt about the relative autonomy and independence of community radio sector. So what then is a kind of macro institutional environment in which community radio can develop itself in South Asia? One of the things that Professor Kanchan and I have been talking, and others have been talking, is to talk about community radio in terms of communication rights. Yeah. Within South Asia, Kanchan, can we go to the next slide? Yeah.
Sure.
Within South Asia, somehow community radio does not seem to be talked about or developed in terms of communication rights. Now, communication rights are not just about freedom of opinion and expression, but it should include areas such as democratic governance of the media, people's participation, their right to participate in one's own culture, to promote their linguistic rights, right to enjoy human creativity, right to education, and so on. Now, community radio, we believe that where people can participate in discussion and debates, but people should have a right to the airwaves. People should have a right to broadcast. Now, if you look at the community radio policies in South Asia, including in India, news is one way in which radio and other media can be used. But if you look at the community radio policy in India, community radio stations are prohibited from broadcasting news, right? In Bangladesh, they restrict news to only developmental news, right? Now, if community radio has to be placed on a pedestal of communication rights, then people must have a right to broadcast news through autonomous, independent spaces like community radio. Yeah, that still doesn't exist. This is another larger context in which you need to understand, and we still don't know how things are going to develop in a new place where community radio is developing, like Bhutan. Right? It is still very much under royal patronage, and they may or may not permit community radios to broadcast news and information. Yeah. Yeah. Now, given all this, you must understand community radio in South Asia as something that has opened up, but in a very cautious manner, in a very guarded manner, because South Asian governments are still wary of an fully independent, autonomous community radio sector. Some of these governments are concerned about how community radio could fall into the wrong hands because of the issues of ethnic conflict, issues of terrorism. The states have their own concerns about how autonomous and how independent they can be. Both Professor Kanchan and I and many other scholars around the world have actually been saying that, especially in regions which are ridden with conflict, community radios can play a major role in peace building. Yeah, and there are a lot of examples from countries in Latin America, which have been conflict prone for decades, which are post-conflict societies. Community media, such as community radio, have been used to rebuild societies and to work for peace. But in our country, that's still a big question mark. Certain parts of the country are declared as disturbed areas, conflict prone regions. In such areas, the government is still reluctant to open up community radio licensing, right? I mean, places like the northeast of India, in Kashmir, and so on, we do not have that many community radio stations. I mean, you can count them on your fingertips. And we believe that community radio actually can be an essential tool for peace building precisely in such regions. Right? Instead of holding back, government should be using community radio to reach the unreached in such regions. One other issue I'll mention briefly before we move on to talking about the different chapters of the book is the issue of sustainability. You meet any community radio station representative, within 2 minutes, the discussion will come down to how do we sustain our stations. Financial sustainability seems to be uppermost on the minds of many community radio stations. There are the costs of establishing the station, but there are also the costs of maintaining it and sustaining the stations. And as a result, with a history of about 10 to 15 years in the South Asia region, sustainability leads to all kinds of interesting situations and aberrations within community radio. The dependence increases on the governments in countries like India and Bangladesh, or dependence on large international agencies or donor agencies, and to what extent can stations sustain themselves as independent, autonomous entities, as long as there are difficulties with financial sustainability is an issue. In India, the government has created some kind of a community radio support scheme, to which stations can apply for funding, and they give some funding, mostly for equipment and infrastructure. This is not still on the model of an open, transparent public funding, a model that many of us have been advocating in India. Like in some other democratic countries, they do have transparent public funding models, which we still don't have. Some amount of advertising is permitted on community radio stations. In India, about 7 minutes of advertising is permitted to 1 hour of broadcast, but community radio stations are mostly located in poor, deprived regions, in rural areas, where it is very difficult to generate that kind of advertising revenues. Yeah, I'll pause here and hand it back to Kanchan. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Yeah. So what we've covered so far is, the broad, scenario of community radio in South Asia. Then some of the issues and challenges. Okay, is there an echo or is it fine?
Yeah, it's
Yeah, we
seems
can.
to be okay, Kanchan, yeah.
So some of the challenges that the sector has been facing, specific to the countries, or South Asia as a region, and in spite of some of those challenges, how the sector has been resilient, the reforms that need to come about for strengthening the sector. And one other major factor that can contribute to community radio, to strengthening community radio in South Asia, and to sustain towards and contribute towards sustainability of community radio sector in South Asia, is the culture of self regulation and peer review. So as the South Asian region gears up for a network of thousands of autonomous community radio stations, this is what we have at UNESCO Chair on Community Media also been talking about, that India should gear up for let's say about 4,000 stations. That's what we had all thought about when community radio, when advocates were talking about community radio in India 20 years back, that there could be as many as 4,000 community radio stations. But now even the ministry is saying that there could be at least one community radio station in every district of India. So as we gear up for these stations, it is important to define a set of codes of practice for these this third tier of broadcasting. So such a code is essential to enhance the integrity of the sector and to enable it to uh, adhere strictly to what we call the core non-negotiable principles that define the sector, some of which are community ownership, non-profit, not-for-profit approach, and community participation. Community participation being the most important. Right? So, community radio stations in South Asia, they must define and identify self-regulatory norms and make ethical choices that put them in convincing position to resist what we are calling the external regulation, right? So they should be regulating themselves in a manner that they don't require to be regulated from outside. So any step to bolster financial sustainability that Professor Pavarala talked about, or social sustainability, must be accompanied by regular performance audit by community radios in South Asia. So anxious about encouraging accountability to the community, there have several steps have been taken in again different countries. So in Nepal, they came up with what is called community radio performance assessment system. They call it CR pass. So you get a pass or fail, right? If you use this assessment system to see whether the community radio stations are functioning in the manner that they should function, are they performing the tasks that they have been set up for or not? So basically to assess the strengths and weaknesses of community radio stations. In India, the UNESCO Chair on Community Media developed an elaborate and participatory toolkit for self-assessment and peer review of community radio stations. We call it Community Radio Continuous Improvement Toolkit, CRCIT. And even the Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, they adopted it for what they called a peer review of community radio stations. So this was also adopted by Bangladesh, and it has gone all the way to East Africa. Right. Now, giving after this background that we have given to you about the community radio sector, and the 20 years of community radio broadcasting that has happened in the region, we'll give you some idea about a sneak peek of sorts of the chapters included in the book, an idea of the range of complexity of issues dealt with by our contributors in the pages of the volume. So in this book, we have endeavored to integrate content that creatively captures the whole scenario of community radio, for a holistic understanding of the sector in this region. However, just to say that you do not find community radio only in South Asia, right? So, like Professor Pavarala said, although we link community radio to being a tool for development, It's not just that you find community radio in developing countries. You find it across the world. You'll find it in the US, you'll find it in Europe, you'll find it in Canada, you'll find it in Australia, you'll find it in all over the world, right? But this book talks about community radio in the South Asia region. So structurally, the book is distributed in three parts. The first section walks the readers through an analytical policy terrain of community radio in South Asia through chapters that closely assess policy ecology in India, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Sri Lanka. Although Sri Lanka and Nepal, we've told you, do not at the moment have a policy, but they have made efforts to come up with a policy, right? The second part comprises articles that contend with macro level techno-social and politico-economic concerns faced in the implementation and practice, basically dealing with the practice aspects of community radio and the challenges that the sector faces in the region. The third and final sector deals with ground level experiences, and the chapters foreground the lived realities faced by grassroots stakeholders of specific community radio, the community radio stations per se, right? So they deal with case studies. So I'll hand over to Professor Pavarala for the policy terrain.
Yeah, so as Professor Kanchan mentioned in our introduction, we were able to mobilize a number of scholars and activists and advocates across South Asia region to contribute to this volume, which is what actually makes this volume a valuable reference book. What I'll do in the next few minutes is to give you some idea of the chapters on policy in this book. So the first chapter in that section by Preeti Raghunath attempts to go beyond the traditional approach to the study of community radio policy. You know, the traditional approach depends on basically going through documents and laws and so on. What Preeti Raghunath does is to use what she calls critical policy ethnography as a methodology and unravels the policy history and the practice of community radio policy making in India, how policies get made for something like a community radio sector in India. So she talks about the deliberative process of policy making, the kind of issues, the various actors involved in policy formulation, and so on. In another chapter, the Bangladeshi communication scholar Muhammad Shahidullah looks at Bangladesh as a developing country in the region that's facing a number of social, economic, political challenges, especially at the rural level. And he examines community radio as having emerged in response to a number of these challenges. If you look at the Bangladesh CR policy, which was adopted in 2008, it states that community radio stations can be established and operated in the spoken languages of marginalized communities with their full participation and management. That's what the policy states. And the stations should reflect their hopes and aspirations, their indigenous knowledge, the resources and cultures of local communities, and so on. And Dr. Shahidullah's focus in this chapter is to ask how Bangladesh incorporates a participatory approach in the planning, management, and programming of community radio. How effectively does it manage to raise the voices of marginalized communities? So he argues that community ownership and participation, capacity building, sustainability are crucial areas that still remain to be addressed in Bangladesh. Moving on to Nepal, we have Dr. Sudhamshu Dahal. And Sudhamshu Dahal's chapter points out quite correctly that Nepal has been a pioneer in establishing community radio in South Asia, much before India had a community radio policy, in fact, right? However, Dahal's chapter once again reiterates the irony of community radio in Nepal, that Nepal has almost like 300 community radio stations without actually having a community radio policy, right? The So he examines the 2015 Constitution of Nepal and its definition of a monolithic nation founded in one language, one religion, one identity, and so on. Uh, and So the Constitution questions this idea of a monolithic nation that used to be there in Nepal for a long time under the monarchy. But to what extent does the diversity of ethnicity and cultural identities get reflected in Nepalese community radio? Uh, this chapter examines community radio in Nepal against the emergence of this new constitution, which is supposed to herald a more multicultural political environment in Nepal. Moving on to Nepal, two scholars, Dr. M.C. Rasmin and Professor Vaniga Sundara, in their chapter, uh, look at the history of development of community radio in Sri Lanka, going back to the so-called Mahaveli community radio, which was an experimental community radio uh, around an irrigation project, large irrigation project in Sri Lanka. And later, the Kotmale Community Radio Project, which was a UNESCO experiment in what was called Internet Community Radio, and a few other stations. The interesting aspect of community radio in Sri Lanka that's brought out by them is even a few stations that are considered to be community radio are in fact only community driven community radio stations, stations that are for community radio and not necessarily owned by communities. Most of these stations are still owned and controlled by the Sri Lankan Broadcasting Community, Sri Lankan Broadcasting Service, SLBC. Now, Sri Lanka is still awaiting legal recognition of community radio, and the authors look at what are the different obstacles to creating genuine community ownership of community radio. So these four chapters bring to you the policy environment within which community radios are either struggling or thriving in the South Asia region. Yeah. So that's the policy terrain explored in the first part of the book. Yeah.
Okay.
Over to you, Kanchan.
So I'll go to the second section of the book, which deals with issues in the community radio praxis. So the first chapter in this section is by Professor Vinod Pavarala, and it makes a case that civil society organizations, media activists, and advocates who ran a campaign for opening up the airwaves from the mid 1990s to early 2000s had emphasized the potential of using community radio for development rather than foregrounding what seemed to be more radical framework of communication rights. So this is a chapter on the NGOisation of community radio in India. So, however, the research and experience over time had compelled him to reflect critically on the role of civil society organizations in the development of community radio in India. So, what this chapter does is it critiques the pitfalls of NGOization of community radio with some concrete cases. It explores the possibilities for recovering community radio from being beholden to NGO goals and donor agency agenda, and to render it as a truly people's medium. So the next chapter is by Ram Bhatt, and it examines the politics and design of spectrum allocation for community radio. The electromagnetic spectrum and its use are often seen as a technical issue without going into social and cultural implications for media and communication sector. This chapter maintains that technology is rarely neutral or innocent, rather, it reflects the wider political economy. While the chapter focuses specifically on the issues of community radio spectrum allocation in India, some of the processes that guide spectrum allocation policies could be used to draw broader conclusions about how technologies are deployed and their social, political, economic, and cultural consequences in the given society. So, next chapter, it is by Hemant Babu, and the chapter examines the paradox of the emergence of a democratic media such as community radio in a monopolistic technology environment of South Asia. In its philosophy and practice, community radio promises to give equal access and control to the communities. However, the medium is heavily dependent on technology, which is historically known for creating a hegemonic relationship among practitioners and technology providers. So the chapter stresses that for independent media, open and independent technology is an absolute prerequisite. The chapter attempts a comparative analysis of regulatory approaches through transmission of audio technology prevalent in India, Bangladesh, and Nepal. So the next screen. So
Yeah.
you'll click on the next four.
Can we change the slide here?
No, it's in this
Yeah.
slide only. So
Oh, it's here only. Okay.
yeah, the three are here. The 12th
Yeah.
is the next. Yes, sir.
So moving on to some more issues related to practice, there is a chapter by Professor Kanchan Malik on the dynamics of gender and participatory development, as well as the complex process of women's empowerment in South Asia. And she examines these issues in specific connection to community radio. And she presents an overview of how women have engaged with community radio in the South Asia region. Uh, the chapter looks at various capacity building efforts that are being carried out to mentor women to participate in program production and management of community radio stations, not only in India but also in Bangladesh and Nepal. She also examines what are the challenges posed by existing social structures, hierarchies that create obstacles for the construction of democratic spaces for women. Uh, she concludes by arguing that community radios within South Asia must become instruments that boost the complex process of women's empowerment by strengthening what she calls the voice capabilities among women. Yeah. The next chapter is a chapter by Ashish Sen, which focuses primarily on community radio and disaster mitigation. And his argument is that within South Asia, the potential for using community radio for disaster mitigation has been grossly underestimated and underutilized. Uh, he believes that there has been lack of proper policy reform in our region compared to countries like Indonesia and Japan, where they have facilitated community radio for disaster mitigation. Even as South Asia is increasingly vulnerable to a number of natural disasters every year, we still don't have a conducive, proactive community radio environment in which radios could be used for disaster mitigation. He looks at a case study of Kalanjiam Vanoli, which is a community radio station in Tamil Nadu, which is India's first community radio station for disaster preparedness, which was set up after the 2004 tsunami in Nagapattinam district of Tamil Nadu. There's been an argument by Ashish Sen and other activists in India that government could actually set aside some frequencies for emergency radios, which could be run like community radio stations. The next chapter is written jointly by N. Ramakrishnan and Venu Arora, and they look at again this difficult issue of sustainability of community radio stations in South Asia. Uh, they examine what are the impact of existing policies on sustainability and the advantages and disadvantages of having a formal policy for community radio. So while we are saying Nepal doesn't have a community radio policy, you know, is that beneficial not to have a community radio policy and let stations do whatever they please in order to sustain themselves? Uh, the second issue they look at involves the institutional character of community radio stations in the South Asian region. Stations in both India and Bangladesh, in comparison to those in Nepal, are not so much local media institutions like in many cases in Nepal, but they are an extension of what you can call public radio, like All India Radio, with a more service orientation or welfare orientation, right? Uh, so this chapter discusses a design for ensuring sustainability of community radio, primarily as a local media resource. How do we build them as sustainable entities to amplify local voices and prioritize marginalized issues is something that these authors are looking at. Uh, then there is a chapter by Pradeep Nayan Thomas, the Australia-based communication scholar, who explores the possibilities for community radio in India to be used for reconciliation of conflicts faced by communities, something that I had flagged in the beginning. So this chapter looks at the diversity and complexity of religions and cultures and the secular fabric that is currently under strain from the pressures of majoritarian and even minoritarian identity politics in India. Right? And these pressures, he argues, have also begun to impact the community radio movement in India. Given that now licenses are being given to religious bodies and religious organizations, some of which have explicit religious and communal agendas. So this is an interesting chapter which concludes by arguing about the possibilities for community radio to be used by communities on the margins in India, especially by communities like the Dalits. Yeah. So these are some of the issues that these chapters look at. Over to you, Kanchan.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. So among the case studies, the next chapter is by Vasuki Belavadi, and that, like we had mentioned before, this chapter recalls the announcement by Ministry of Information and Broadcasting that it was keen on introducing a process of performance evaluation by community radio stations, and that had generated a debate about the methods to be adopted for such an exercise. So after some discussion, Ministry agreed to a process of self-assessment and peer review by community radio station in the spirit of co-learning as against an external evaluation of the sector. By then, 3 toolkits for self-assessment had been developed by different agencies that had academic as well as altruistic stakes in the sector. And the ministry adopted them as part of what it called a peer review process. What this chapter examines is the participatory process that went into the development of one of these toolkits, that is the Community Radio Continuous Improvement Toolkit, or the CRCIT. The next chapter is by Madhavi Manchi, and it is based on a case study which it extends the ideas from material media ecology practice, affect theories, memory studies, and ethnoecology to study a community radio station in Telangana that is embedded within a larger biodiversity movement in the region. Working through women's collectives, the community seeks to gain autonomy over 5 major aspects of their lives: food production, seeds, natural resources, market, and the media. So the author believes that Sangam Radio, which is part of the autonomy on media, lies within a unique interlay of memory, media, and biodiversity, and serves an important archival and mnemonic functions within the larger movement. She argues that spaces such as community radio need to be recognized and celebrated as they provide a real alternative to the homogenizing tendency of neoliberalization. Our next chapter it was contributed by Bidu Bhushan Das and brings out the complexity of the production process of a community radio program where participation must be the core principle. The juxtaposition of the implied meaning of Chopal as an open public space and how it is a site of power hierarchies in the day to day functioning in a village system reveals the challenges faced in program production. The chapter is based on an ethnographic study of a community radio station in Bundelkhand region in central India and explores the role of community radio in the promotion of grassroots democracy, where the society, culture, and economy are not quite democratic. The program Gaon Ki Chopal, which translates as Village Chopal, produced by two community radio reporters, appears to have improved people's involvement in community radio programs. However, it is not simple to produce and broadcast such programs in feudal societies, the chapter asserts. Finally, we have a chapter by Priya Kapoor that examines how the Himalayan communities whose youth are mobilized by the incidents of Tehri Dam and Chipko movements help their communities during the recurrent disasters, especially floods. She studies community radio sites that assert identity and agency of local youth from the Tehri Garhwal region to serve as indispensable intermediaries when floods paralyze life in the region. The theoretical insights include scholarly discourses of disaster and risk, climate change, and the community media to assert that community radio has strong synergies with issues such as climate change, especially during the instances of natural disaster. She suggests that unless community radio sector is recognized as a close ally of local and national governments, climate change and disaster cannot be mitigated nor communities made resilient. So, with that, we come to the end of the chapters, and I'll hand over to Professor Pavarala to wrap it up in the last slide. Yes.
Yeah, this last part is only to highlight a small structural feature in the book. If you look at the book, each chapter in the book is followed by a boxed news story about community radio that is broadly related to the theme of that chapter. These stories are in the form of interviews, small news reports that appeared in something called CR News, which is an e-newsletter that we bring out at the UNESCO Chair on Community Media at University of Hyderabad. So what these boxes do is they serve to separate one chapter from the other, but they also bring to the readers a flavor of the real world happenings in the CR sector in South Asia over the last decade, and also to bring to the fore the voices of some of the main actors in community radio who are grassroots practitioners, community radio enthusiasts who work in the field. After all, as the legendary South African community broadcaster Zeni Ibrahim has put it, community radio is 99% about community and only 1% about radio. So to some extent, our effort to bring in these boxed perspectives from communities at the field level is to make a nodding gesture towards this principle that community radio is mainly about community. So that grateful to all the contributors, about 17 different authors who have contributed to this volume. They live in 7 different countries. They are academicians, researchers, experts, people who follow community radio very, very closely. So we are thankful to all of them, and thanks for listening to us. And hopefully, some of you will get to lay your hands on the volume, and this is a good resource if you want to get a quick understanding of community radio situation in the entire South Asia region. So thanks once again to Amrita for inviting us. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Kanchan, Malik, and Dr. Vinod Pavarala. That was a very enriched and knowledgeable session. Now we are moving to the question and answer session. Participants from both online and offline can participate in the question and answer section. Those who have any questions can answer.
I hope I've stopped sharing the slide.
Yeah, sure, ma'am.
Oh, I think it stopped already, no? Yeah.
It stopped. I think it stopped automatically. So, yep.
Now, participants can ask any questions if you have.
Okay, we have.
I see one hand raised.
Yes, Swati Arjun.
It's from online.
Can I go ahead?
Yes, yeah.
Can I ask the question, ma'am?
Yes,
Yeah,
sure.
please go ahead.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Good afternoon, Kanchan, ma'am. Good afternoon, sir. This is Swati Arjun.
Good afternoon.
Sir, my question is with both of you. When we were talking about the limitation of community radio, so and I just want to understand where does podcast stands as an alternative for community radio?
Kanchan?
So, yeah. Podcast, you're saying?
Yes, ma'am. Because
Kanchan, you want to take a shot?
Okay. So podcast would be again, it requires the internet, first of all, right? It's the digital
Yes,
media
ma'am.
that you're talking about. So the accessibility to digital media still, there's a question mark on that, first of all, right? So we are talking about reaching out to the people in the rural areas, so that is a question, right? So when we are talking about community media here, a podcast can play a role also. That should be available to the communities, but at the same time, we should also have community radio available for the communities there. So it is not one against the other. All media that are there, it should be accessible to the communities is our point, basically.
I think the main hindrance, Swati, to using anything that requires internet and connectivity is the digital divide. Especially considering that community radios are for people on the margins in rural areas. The penetration of internet in our kind of country is still not good enough. However, if there are community radio stations who have access to internet and who have decent connectivity, whose audiences have connectivity, they are at liberty to use other distribution platforms, including podcasting. It's not a production technology. It's a distributing platform.
Yes. And we look at community radio not just about, just as a technology or as a distribution technology. We are looking at also the production side. So we look at, community radio as a social process where the process of making the program is the important thing, not just where it is put. So if all the community radio programs also get a podcast as a platform for distributing their programs, that's also good. It's the production process, which should be done in a community radio manner. That's the important thing that we're looking, right?
Yes, ma'am. I got your point. Actually, I came to this question because what was going into my mind was the lack of government support to community radio and how there is a lack of infrastructure. And I was thinking in the direction that podcast, since I'm seeing it here, requires considerably very less amount of infrastructure than setting up a community radio station. So I was thinking in that way.
No, we completely understand where you're coming from. A lot of people who've not been able to get the community radio license are going in for internet radio. But like Professor Pavarala said, there are issues of internet, of digital divide. Even during, the COVID-19, a lot of the community radio stations were trying to bridge this digital divide in rural areas where people were not able to access information through digital platforms, and they were trying to get this information through the community radio, right? Not everybody has access to internet, so that is an issue.
Okay, in that ways, both can complement each other. That is one way that we can look forward to.
Absolutely.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Any more questions?
We have talked almost for an hour. I'm sure the students have picked up at least some keywords and have questions.
Yeah, since it was a book, we had to make it a little academic, couldn't make it freewheeling. So,
but if there is something that struck you as interesting or provocative or whatever, please feel free to raise some questions.
you've heard of community radio in Kerala?
Yeah, has anyone heard of any community radio stations in Kerala?
Yeah, ma'am.
Yeah, can you name a few of them? Any one of them? And then where are they located?
So one of the major community radio is Radio Matuli.
Yes.
And where is it?
Wayanad.
Do you know where it is located?
Wayanad.
In Wayanad, yes.
So, Amrita Vidyapit does not have a community radio station.
No, ma'am. We don't have a community radio, and we are planning to launch it soon, so
Yes.
that we have such a kind of discussion and interaction with you to get more points on it.
Very nice.
Yeah.
So, what do the students think in this age of in the digital era? Is it relevant to talk about radios at all? Broadcasting and radio?
Yeah, students, you just give a answer to the question like whether it is relevant at this moment.
Or it's already an old medium that has no meaning today.
They're all shy, not talking.
So they are very silent.
I think they're all hungry. It's 1 o'clock.
Anyway, I'm likely to meet them again.
I'm curious to know one other thing. So have they heard about community radio before this? They had heard about community radio before this? Before
Yes,
this lecture today?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. All right. Sure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kanchan Malik and Dr. Vinod Pavarala for the insightful session. And on behalf of the School of Arts and Science, we heartfully thank you, both of you, for this session. Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure.